At 57 years old, Rebecca Turner thought the hardest chapter of her life was finally behind her. She was wrong. After 31 years of marriage, her husband walked away. The divorce drained most of her savings, divided everything they had built together, and left her standing alone in an almost empty house she could no longer afford to keep. Within months, the life she had known for decades was gone. Friends told her to move closer to town. Her sister suggested a retirement community. Others encouraged her to start over somewhere warm and comfortable. Instead, Rebecca made a decision that everyone called a mistake. She moved into an abandoned mountain cabin that had belonged to her grandfather. The cabin sat deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, miles from the nearest town. The roof leaked, the chimney barely worked, the well pump was unreliable. Winter was only weeks away. Most people would have sold it. Rebecca couldn't, because for the first time in years, she needed something that belonged only to her. What she didn't know was that surviving on the mountain would become the least of her challenges. As she repaired broken walls, chopped firewood, and prepared the cabin for the coming winter, she began noticing small things that didn't make sense. A locked room no one mentioned, old journals hidden in a forgotten trunk, strange markings carved into support beams. Then one evening, while replacing damaged floorboards in a room that had been sealed for decades, Rebecca discovered a letter hidden beneath the floor. A letter her grandfather never mailed. A letter addressed to a woman no one in the family had ever talked about. And what she learned from that letter would uncover a secret buried in the mountains for more than 50 years. But before Rebecca pulls up those floorboards and discovers what was hidden underneath, let me ask you something. Where are you listening from today? And what time is it where you are right now? As for me, I'm currently in Arkansas, and I'd love to see how far this story travels around the world. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, mountain survival, hidden family secrets, forgotten cabins, and incredible discoveries, make sure to subscribe to the channel and join our community for more stories just like this. Now, let's go back to the beginning and see how a divorced woman with nowhere left to turn ended up alone on a mountain with an old cabin, a long winter ahead, and a mystery waiting beneath the floorboards. The divorce became official on a Thursday morning in early October. Rebecca Turner remembered the exact date because it was the same day the first cold front of the season swept through town. The air felt sharper when she walked out of the courthouse, carrying a manila envelope filled with legal papers and 31 years of memories reduced to signatures and stamps. Her ex-husband, Michael, stood near the parking lot, speaking quietly with his attorney. For a moment, she considered saying goodbye. Not out of love. That part had faded long ago. But because people weren't supposed to disappear from your life after 3 decades together. In the end, she simply got into her car and drove away. The silence inside the vehicle felt unfamiliar. For most of her adult life, there had always been another voice, another opinion, another person occupying the passenger seat. Now there was only the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional crackle from the radio. That evening, Rebecca sat alone in the nearly empty house that would soon belong to someone else. Most of the furniture had already been sold. Family photographs were packed into boxes stacked against the wall. The rooms echoed when she walked through them. She carried a cup of coffee into the kitchen and found herself staring at a faded pencil mark near the doorway. Years earlier, she and Michael had measured their son's height there every birthday until he moved across the country. The marks remained. The child was gone. The marriage was gone. Soon the house would be gone too. Rebecca ran her finger across the old pencil line and suddenly laughed. Not because anything was funny, because if she didn't laugh, she suspected she might cry. The following week became a blur of paperwork and difficult decisions. The settlement left her with enough money to survive, but not enough to comfortably retire. Friends offered suggestions. Her sister Karen called almost every day. "Move closer to me," Karen insisted during one conversation. "You don't need to be alone right now." Rebecca appreciated the concern. She really did. But every option seemed to involve starting over in a place that didn't feel like hers. One afternoon, while sorting through old documents, she discovered a letter from an attorney she had nearly forgotten about. The letter concerned a property inherited years earlier after her grandfather's death. Rebecca hadn't paid much attention at the time. The property was an old mountain cabin located deep within the Blue Ridge Mountains. Most family members assumed she would eventually sell it. Somehow she never had. The cabin sat untouched for nearly 12 years. Forgotten, but technically still hers. That evening she pulled an old photo album from storage. After several minutes of searching, she found a picture taken when she was 12 years old. The photograph showed her standing beside her grandfather in front of a weathered log cabin surrounded by towering pine trees. She remembered that summer vividly. The smell of wood smoke, the creek running behind the cabin, long evenings sitting on the porch while her grandfather told stories about storms and wildlife. It was one of the few places she remembered feeling completely safe. A week later, Rebecca found herself driving toward the mountains. She hadn't made a final decision yet. Officially, she was only going to inspect the property before listing it for sale. At least, that was what she kept telling herself. The road narrowed as she climbed higher into the hills. Cell service disappeared. Forest replaced farmland. The landscape grew increasingly wild with every mile. By late afternoon, she turned onto an old gravel road and immediately recognized it. Memories returned faster than expected. The sharp bend near the creek, the abandoned fence posts, the ridge overlooking the valley. Then the cabin finally appeared through the trees. Rebecca slowed the car and stared. Time had not been kind. The roof sagged noticeably near one corner. Several shutters hung loose. Tall weeds surrounded the porch. One section of railing had collapsed entirely. The place looked tired, almost defeated. Yet beneath the neglect, she could still see the cabin she remembered. She parked and stepped out into the cool mountain air. The silence surprised her. No traffic, no distant sirens, no neighbors mowing lawns, just wind moving through pine branches overhead. For several moments, she simply stood there listening. Then a voice called out from somewhere behind her. "Didn't think anybody was coming back." Rebecca turned quickly. An older man stood near the edge of the tree line carrying an armload of firewood. He looked to be in his mid-60s, with a gray beard and the weathered face of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "Sorry," Rebecca asked. The man nodded toward the cabin. "Been empty a long time." "You live nearby?" He laughed. "Nearest neighbor for 5 miles. Rebecca smiled politely. "I'm Rebecca Turner." "Hank Walker." They shook hands. His grip felt strong and rough from years of manual work. Hank glanced toward the cabin again. "You planning to sell it?" The question came so quickly that Rebecca almost answered yes. Instead, she hesitated. "I haven't decided." Hank looked genuinely pleased by that response. "Good." "Why?" The old man shifted the firewood under one arm. "Mountain's got enough empty cabins already." Before leaving, he pointed toward the roof. "Storm coming next week." Rebecca followed his gaze. Dark clouds were gathering beyond the distant ridgeline. "That bad?" Hank nodded. "Bad enough you'll want that roof fixed." Then he started back toward the trees. After a few steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. Your grandfather always said the cabin takes care of people willing to take care of it. With that, he disappeared into the forest. Rebecca stood alone once more. The wind rustled through the pines. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called from the mountainside. Slowly, she looked back at the cabin. For the first time since the divorce, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not happiness, not certainty, just possibility. She didn't know it yet, but that weathered old cabin would soon challenge her, frustrate her, nearly break her during the winter ahead, and eventually lead her to a secret hidden beneath its floorboards for more than half a century. Rebecca decided to spend 3 days at the cabin before making any decision about its future. By the end of the first morning, she realized 3 days might not be enough to understand everything that was wrong with the place. The cabin looked worn from the outside. Inside, it was worse. The front door scraped against the floor every time she opened it. 2 windows wouldn't close completely. The kitchen sink leaked steadily into a bucket someone had placed beneath the pipes years ago. Dust coated nearly every surface. Mouse droppings appeared in corners she hadn't noticed the day before. Most concerning of all, the old wood stove that served as the cabin's primary heat source hadn't been used in over a decade. Rebecca spent the morning moving room to room with a notebook, writing down repairs. The list grew alarmingly fast. Roof damage, broken shutters, rotten porch boards, water stains on the ceiling, faulty wiring. By lunchtime, she had filled 4 pages. Standing in the kitchen, she stared at the list and laughed quietly to herself. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked the empty room. The cabin offered no answer. Around 1 o'clock, she heard the sound of an engine outside. Through the window, she spotted an old pickup truck climbing the gravel driveway. A few moments later, Hank Walker appeared carrying a toolbox and a paper sack. "Figured you'd still be here," he said as though continuing a conversation they'd started yesterday. Rebecca smiled. "What gave it away?" Hank looked toward the cabin. "You haven't run away screaming yet." He handed her the paper sack. Inside were 2 sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. "You brought lunch." "Mountain Rule." "What's that?" Hank shrugged. "If somebody's fixing a cabin, somebody else brings food." The explanation sounded perfectly reasonable in a place like this. They sat on the porch steps eating sandwiches while Hank studied the roof. "You planning to stay through winter?" he asked. Rebecca nearly choked on her drink. "I haven't even decided if I'm staying through next week." Hank nodded. "Smart answer." Then he pointed toward the mountains beyond the valley. "First snow usually arrives earlier than newcomers expect." During the afternoon, Hank helped inspect the cabin. The old ranger moved carefully from room to room, tapping beams, examining walls, and checking foundations. Occasionally, he grunted. Rebecca quickly learned those grunts were not encouraging. In one bedroom, Hank pushed against part of the wall and frowned. "What's wrong?" Rebecca asked. "Nothing serious." He paused. "Yet." "I don't like that answer." Hank laughed. "Neither do homeowners." Despite the problems, he found some good news. The foundation remained solid. The chimney could be repaired. Most of the structural damage was manageable. Expensive, but manageable. As they worked, Rebecca noticed something interesting. Hank seemed unusually familiar with the property. He knew where tools had once been stored. He knew which windows tended to stick. He even knew which floorboards squeaked. "How often were you here?" she finally asked. Hank stopped tightening a loose hinge. "Your grandfather and I were friends." "Close friends." Close enough to argue with each other twice a week. Rebecca smiled. That sounded exactly like her grandfather. Before leaving, Hank paused near the living room fireplace. You know he built most of this cabin himself. Rebecca looked around. Really? Took him almost 5 years. Hank rested one hand on the mantel. Never met a more stubborn man. The comment stayed with her long after he drove away. That evening, Rebecca decided to light the wood stove for the first time. The process proved far more difficult than expected. The fire died twice. Smoke filled part of the room. She nearly dropped a burning log onto the floor. By the time flames finally caught properly, she was sweaty, frustrated, and covered in soot. Yet when warmth slowly spread through the cabin, she felt oddly proud. It wasn't much, just a fire. Still, it was something she had done herself. As darkness settled over the mountains, the cabin began making noises. Wood creaked softly as temperatures dropped. Wind brushed against the walls. Branches scratched the roof. City life had trained Rebecca to ignore background sounds. Here, every noise seemed amplified. Around 9 o'clock, while reading beside the stove, she heard a distinct thump from somewhere deeper inside the cabin. She looked up immediately. Silence followed. Then another thump. This one seemed to come from the rear hallway. Rebecca set down her book and grabbed a flashlight. The hallway led to a storage room she hadn't fully explored. Most of the space contained old furniture covered by dusty sheets. Boxes sat stacked against one wall. Nothing appeared unusual. Then her flashlight beam landed on a wooden door at the back of the room. She frowned. She didn't remember seeing it before. The door was smaller than standard size, almost hidden behind shelves and old equipment. Curious. She crossed the room and tried the handle. It didn't move. Locked. Rebecca examined the surface more closely. The wood looked older than the surrounding walls. More interestingly, faint scratch marks surrounded the lock as though someone had attempted to open it years ago. She crouched lower and noticed something else. Carved into the frame near the bottom corner was a small symbol. Not a name, not initials, just a simple mark she didn't recognize. 3 intersecting lines enclosed within a rough circle. The carving appeared old, very old. For several seconds, Rebecca stared at it. Then she remembered something. Earlier that day, while cleaning dust from the attic ladder, she had seen the exact same symbol scratched into one of the support beams overhead. At the time, she assumed it was random. Now she wasn't so sure. The locked door suddenly felt more interesting than it should have. Outside, wind swept through the trees. Inside, Rebecca stood in the beam of her flashlight, staring at a room her grandfather apparently wanted sealed. And for the first time since arriving at the cabin, curiosity began to compete with survival on her growing list of priorities. Rebecca woke before sunrise because the cabin was cold. Not slightly cold. Mountain in October cold. The fire in the wood stove had burned down to glowing embers sometime during the night, and the temperature inside the cabin felt only a few degrees warmer than outside. She sat up beneath 3 blankets and immediately questioned every life decision that had brought her there. Through the frosted window, she could see the first gray light touching the tops of the pine trees. Her breath fogged faintly in front of her face. For several minutes, she remained in bed, trying to gather the courage to leave the warmth of the blankets. Eventually, survival won. The stove wouldn't relight itself. 45 minutes later, she was standing outside wearing work gloves and carrying an axe that had belonged to her grandfather. A pile of split firewood sat beside the porch, but it was smaller than she remembered. Much smaller. If she planned to stay through the season, she would need far more. The realization bothered her. In town, heat came from turning a thermostat. Here, warmth had weight. It had to be cut, stacked, carried, and protected from rain. Every degree of comfort required work. Rebecca studied a fallen tree near the edge of the clearing and decided it looked manageable. 20 minutes later, she discovered she knew absolutely nothing about splitting firewood. The first swing missed completely. The second glanced off the log and nearly spun the axe from her hands. By the fifth attempt, her shoulders already hurt. When Hank's pickup appeared around mid-morning, he found her staring at a stubborn piece of wood as though considering legal action against it. The old ranger climbed out of his truck and watched silently for a moment. "You trying to split that log or negotiate with it?" Rebecca laughed despite herself. At the moment, neither seems to be working. Hank picked up the axe and positioned the log differently. One clean strike split it in half. "Wood's like people," he said. "You gotta figure out where it's weak before you start hitting it." That sounds suspiciously philosophical. That's because I'm old. The lesson lasted nearly an hour. By the end, Rebecca was finally producing usable firewood instead of embarrassing herself. More importantly, she was beginning to understand the rhythm of mountain life. Small tasks mattered. Neglected chores became problems. Preparation was survival. That afternoon brought a new challenge. The cabin's water pressure suddenly vanished. One moment the kitchen faucet worked, the next it produced nothing but a weak sputter. Rebecca immediately imagined expensive repairs. Hank followed the water line downhill until they reached an aging hand pump connected to a spring-fed system. "Good news," he said after a brief inspection. "What's the good news?" "It's not broken." Rebecca smiled. "And the bad news?" Hank pointed toward a clogged intake screen filled with leaves and debris. "You've got about 15 minutes of cleaning ahead of you." Compared to replacing a pump, 15 minutes felt like a victory. As they worked, Rebecca asked about the symbol she had discovered near the locked door. Hank's reaction was subtle but noticeable. His hands paused briefly before continuing. "You found one?" he asked. "More than one." The old ranger nodded slowly. "Your grandfather carved those." "What do they mean?" "Never told me." The answer sounded truthful. Yet something about his expression suggested there was more to the story. Before she could ask another question, Hank changed the subject by pointing toward dark clouds gathering beyond the ridgeline. "Storm's moving faster than I thought." By late afternoon, the sky had turned steel gray. Wind moved through the trees with increasing force. Rebecca spent the next several hours securing loose items around the property. She stacked firewood beneath a tarp, closed shutters, moved tools into storage. Every task felt strangely satisfying. For the first time in months, her thoughts weren't occupied by lawyers, divorce papers, or financial worries. The mountain demanded attention. There wasn't much room left for self-pity. Shortly before sunset, while organizing supplies in the attic, she noticed another carving of the mysterious symbol. This one appeared on a support beam hidden behind old crates. Curious. She examined the surrounding area more closely. Her flashlight landed on something unexpected. A small metal hook attached beneath the beam. Hanging from it was a leather pouch covered in dust. Rebecca carefully lowered it. Inside, she found several old keys. Most were rusted beyond use. One, however, remained in surprisingly good condition. Long, brass, older than anything she'd seen elsewhere in the cabin. Her pulse quickened immediately. She thought about the locked door, the one hidden behind shelves in the rear hallway, the one her grandfather apparently wanted sealed. For several seconds, she simply stared at the key resting in her palm. Then thunder rolled across the mountains outside. The approaching storm rattled the windows. Rebecca slipped the key into her pocket and climbed down from the attic. Night arrived quickly. Rain began falling just after dark. Wind shook the cabin hard enough to make the walls creak. Yet despite the weather, Rebecca found herself standing in the storage room holding a flashlight and looking at the locked door once again. The brass key felt heavy in her hand. Maybe it fit. Maybe it didn't. Either way, she was about to find out why her grandfather had hidden it in the attic all those years ago. The brass key slid into the lock as though it had been waiting there for decades. Rebecca stood motionless in the narrow storage room, listening to rain hammer against the cabin roof. The storm had intensified since sunset. Wind rattled the shutters, branches scraped against the walls outside. For several seconds, she simply stared at the key protruding from the old lock. Then she turned it. The mechanism resisted at first. A loud metallic click echoed through the room. Rebecca felt a small surge of excitement, immediately followed by nervousness. She wasn't entirely sure what she expected to find. Hidden treasures seemed unlikely. Family secrets seemed far more probable. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door inward. The hinges groaned loudly. Dust swirled through the beam of her flashlight. The room beyond was smaller than she expected, barely large enough for a bed and a desk. No windows. No furniture except for a wooden chair positioned against one wall. The space felt strangely untouched, not abandoned, preserved, as though someone had deliberately left everything exactly as it was. Rebecca stepped inside carefully. The air smelled of old wood and paper. Her flashlight revealed shelves lining the walls. Most were empty. A few contained weathered books and notebooks. Then she noticed something hanging above the chair. A framed photograph. She moved closer. The image showed her grandfather as a young man standing beside another person she didn't recognize. Both were smiling. Both appeared to be standing somewhere in the mountains. Written across the bottom was a date from 1974. Rebecca frowned. She had never seen the photograph before. More surprising was the second person. Family gatherings had always included endless stories and pictures, yet she didn't recognize the face at all. She examined the shelves next. Several journals sat stacked neatly together. Dust covered them, but not nearly as much as she expected. That detail struck her immediately. Someone had entered this room after it was supposedly locked. Recently. Years ago. She couldn't tell. A loud crack of thunder interrupted her thoughts. The cabin shook noticeably. Almost immediately, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then everything went dark. Perfect, Rebecca muttered. The power had been unreliable from the beginning. Now it was gone entirely. She returned to the living room and lit several lanterns. Outside, rain poured down in sheets. The storm had arrived in full force. Through the window, she watched pine trees bending under powerful gusts. For the first time since arriving, she understood why Hank had been so concerned about preparing for winter. The mountains didn't care whether she was ready. Nature wasn't interested in excuses. Around midnight, a loud bang jolted her awake. Rebecca sat upright instantly. The sound came from outside. Another crash followed. She grabbed a flashlight and pulled on a jacket. Wind hit her the moment she opened the door. Rain soaked her within seconds. The beam of light swept across the clearing until she spotted the problem. A large pine branch had broken free during the storm and crashed onto part of the porch roof. It hadn't collapsed the structure, but one corner now sagged noticeably. Rebecca stared at the damage while rain dripped from her hair. She could almost hear city friends telling her this was exactly why people didn't live alone on mountains. Yet instead of feeling defeated, she felt strangely determined. At dawn, the storm finally moved east. The mountain emerged, soaked but intact. Rebecca brewed coffee on the wood stove and stepped onto the porch to assess the damage. Less than 30 minutes later, Hank's truck appeared. Apparently, mountain neighbors developed a sixth sense for storm damage. "How bad?" he asked before even shutting off the engine. Rebecca pointed toward the roof. Hank studied it for several moments. "Could have been worse." "That's encouraging." "No, that's reality." Together, they spent most of the day clearing debris and reinforcing the damaged section. The work was exhausting. By afternoon, Rebecca's arms ached and her hands were blistered. Yet the cabin looked stronger than it had 24 hours earlier. During a break, she told Hank about the hidden room. The old ranger listened quietly while drinking coffee from a thermos. "You know about it?" Rebecca asked. Hank nodded. "Your grandfather called it the study." "Why was it locked?" For the first time since she'd met him, Hank seemed unsure how to answer. "Some memories are easier to keep behind a door." The response raised more questions than it answered. Later that evening, after Hank left, Rebecca returned to the hidden room. This time she examined the journals more carefully. Most contained ordinary entries, weather observations, notes about repairs, hunting records, trail conditions. Then she found one notebook that immediately stood out. The cover bore no title, no dates, only the same strange symbol carved near the locked door and hidden in the attic. Her pulse quickened. She opened the journal carefully. The first pages appeared normal enough. Then she reached an entry dated June 1974. The handwriting belonged to her grandfather. "I received another letter from Eleanor today." Rebecca froze. Eleanor. The name appeared alone on the page, yet something about it felt important, familiar somehow, despite never hearing it before. She continued reading. The entry referenced meetings, promises, and a disagreement that seemed deeply personal. Then several pages later, she found something even stranger. Entire sections had been removed, not torn by accident, cut out cleanly with a blade. Someone had deliberately taken specific pages from the journal. Rebecca slowly turned another page. More missing sections. Then another. Near the center of the notebook, she discovered a small folded map hidden between two entries. It showed the surrounding mountain region. Several locations had been marked in red pencil. One of those marks sat directly beneath the cabin itself. Beside it, written in her grandfather's careful handwriting, were 4 simple words. She must never know. Rebecca stared at the sentence while evening shadows stretched across the room. Outside, water dripped from pine branches after the storm. Inside, she suddenly had the feeling that the mystery hidden in the cabin was far older and far more personal than she had imagined. Rebecca spent the next 3 days preparing the cabin for colder weather. The mystery of the hidden room lingered constantly in the back of her mind, but mountain life had a way of demanding attention. Firewood needed splitting. The damaged porch roof required temporary repairs. The water system needed regular maintenance. Every morning she woke with a list of jobs, and somehow ended each evening with an even longer one. Yet something surprising happened during those days. For the first time since the divorce, she stopped thinking about Michael every hour. Sometimes half a day passed before his name even crossed her mind. The realization felt strange, almost disloyal, then liberating. One cold morning, she stood outside stacking firewood while fog drifted through the trees. The mountains were silent except for the rhythmic sound of logs knocking together. As she worked, a pickup truck appeared at the edge of the clearing. This time it wasn't Hank. A woman climbed out carrying a cardboard box. She looked to be in her early 60s, with silver hair tied into a loose braid and a thick flannel jacket. "You must be Rebecca," she called. Rebecca set down a log. "I am." The woman smiled warmly. "Name's Martha Collins. I live down near the river." Rebecca laughed. "I thought Hank was my nearest neighbor." "He is. I just like ignoring geography." Within minutes, Martha was sitting on the porch drinking coffee while telling stories about local weather disasters. She spoke quickly, moving from one topic to another without warning. The cardboard box turned out to contain homemade bread, jars of jam, and enough baked goods to feed a small army. "Mountain rule," Martha explained. "Nobody survives their first winter alone." Rebecca smiled. "Hank mentioned a mountain rule, too." Martha rolled her eyes. "That man invents new mountain rules every week." Before leaving, Martha casually mentioned something that immediately caught Rebecca's attention. "Your grandfather used to spend hours in that little study room." Rebecca froze. "You knew about the room?" "Everybody did." "Really?" Martha nodded. "He practically lived in there some winters." The answer surprised Rebecca. If everyone knew about the room, why lock it? Why hide the key? Why remove pages from the journals? After Martha left, Rebecca returned to the study. Sunlight streamed through the small doorway while dust floated lazily through the air. She spent hours examining shelves, photographs, and notebooks. Eventually, she focused on the map hidden inside her grandfather's journal. The red mark beneath the cabin continued bothering her. It wasn't positioned inside the study. It wasn't centered on the fireplace. It appeared to indicate a specific location near the rear section of the building. Curious. She grabbed a measuring tape and began comparing distances. The process took most of the afternoon. Twice she became convinced she was chasing nonsense. Then she noticed something unusual. The measurements consistently led toward a guest bedroom rarely used by anyone. The room sat near the back corner of the cabin. At first glance, nothing seemed remarkable about it. A bed, a dresser, a small window overlooking the forest. Yet when Rebecca walked across the floor, she heard it immediately. One section sounded different. Hollow. She stopped and walked over it again. The sound repeated. Her pulse quickened slightly. She knelt and examined the floorboards. Most were worn evenly with age. One section appeared newer. Not new exactly, just newer than the surrounding wood. Someone had replaced those boards years ago. The discovery occupied her thoughts through dinner. By evening, curiosity finally won. Rebecca moved the bed aside and returned with a flashlight and screwdriver. The first board resisted. The second resisted even more. By the time she loosened several screws, darkness had fully settled outside. Wind whispered through the trees beyond the window. Carefully, she lifted one edge of the floorboard. Beneath it sat only darkness. Her flashlight beam revealed a narrow cavity between the joists. At first, she saw nothing. Then something caught the light. A small metal object. Rebecca reached inside and pulled it free. It was an old tin box roughly the size of a paperback novel. Rust covered most of the surface. Her heart pounded as she carefully opened it. Inside, she found several black and white photographs wrapped in cloth. The first showed her grandfather standing beside a young woman, not her grandmother. The second showed the same woman standing near a mountain survey marker. The third photograph made Rebecca sit back slowly. Written across the bottom in faded ink were two names, James Turner and Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor, the same name from the journal, the same woman mentioned in the missing pages. Rebecca stared at the photograph for several moments. The woman looked familiar somehow, not because she had seen her before, because certain features resembled people in her own family. The shape of her eyes, the smile. The resemblance was subtle but impossible to ignore. Then she discovered something tucked beneath the photographs. A folded envelope, yellowed with age, sealed across the front. Written in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting were 4 words that instantly sent a chill through her. For Eleanor. Never sent. Rebecca sat on the floor beside the exposed boards long after darkness filled the room. The unopened envelope rested in her hands. She had discovered journals, hidden maps, and strange symbols since arriving at the cabin. But this felt different, personal, intimate. Whatever mystery surrounded Eleanor Hayes, it wasn't just a historical curiosity. It had mattered deeply to her grandfather. The words written across the envelope made that clear. For Eleanor, never sent, outside. Wind moved softly through the pine trees. The cabin creaked occasionally as temperatures dropped. Finally, Rebecca broke the seal. The paper inside had yellowed with age but remained surprisingly well preserved. She unfolded the letter carefully and began reading. Eleanor, if you're reading this, then I finally found the courage to tell the truth. Rebecca immediately felt her pulse quicken. The letter continued for several pages. Her grandfather, James Turner, described events from the summer of 1974. He wrote about long days spent surveying remote mountain property. He wrote about friendships, disagreements, and decisions he regretted. Most importantly, he wrote about Eleanor. Yet the relationship described in the letter wasn't romantic. Not exactly. The tone carried affection and loyalty, but also guilt. Deep guilt. Several passages had been crossed out. Others seemed intentionally vague. Then one sentence made Rebecca stop reading entirely. They never told you who your father was. Rebecca stared at the line, then read it again. The words didn't make sense, or perhaps they made too much sense. Slowly, she continued. According to the letter, Eleanor had spent most of her life searching for answers about her family. James believed she deserved the truth. Unfortunately, the next page had been removed, not torn, cut out cleanly, just like the missing journal pages. Rebecca felt a wave of frustration. The most important section was gone. She searched the envelope again. Nothing. The missing page had vanished decades ago. The following morning, she carried the letter to the kitchen table and read it twice more while drinking coffee. Every time she reached the missing section, her mind filled the gap with possibilities. By mid-morning, she drove into town hoping for distraction. Supplies were running low anyway. The small mountain community sat 20 minutes down a winding road. Most of the buildings looked unchanged from the photographs she'd seen in family albums. Rebecca stopped at a hardware store for nails and roofing supplies. While paying, she noticed an elderly man studying her from the far end of the counter. Eventually, he approached. "You're James Turner's granddaughter." It wasn't a question. Rebecca smiled. "I am." The man nodded slowly. "You look like him, around the eyes." She had heard similar comments before. Usually they made her uncomfortable. Today they felt oddly welcome. "Did you know my grandfather?" she asked. The old man laughed. Everybody knew James. Rebecca couldn't help smiling. Every small town seemed to have the same answer. "I'm Walter Bishop," he said. "Used to run survey crews back in the day." The word survey immediately caught her attention. In the 70s. Walter's expression shifted slightly. "Among other years." Rebecca hesitated before mentioning Eleanor's name. The reaction was immediate. Walter stopped smiling. Not dramatically, just enough for her to notice. "You knew her too?" she asked. The old surveyor glanced toward the store entrance before answering. "Long time ago." "Was she a surveyor?" "No." His answer came quickly, too quickly. "Then how did she know my grandfather?" Walter rubbed the back of his neck. Some questions get harder with age. Before Rebecca could continue, another customer entered the store and interrupted them. The conversation ended there. Yet as she carried supplies to her truck, Walter followed her outside. "Your grandfather was a good man," he said quietly. "He carried things he shouldn't have had to carry." Rebecca frowned. "What does that mean?" The old man looked toward the mountains. "If you're finding old papers up there, keep looking." Then he walked away. The drive home felt longer than usual. Clouds gathered above the ridgelines, casting long shadows across the valleys. Back at the cabin, Rebecca returned to work. Survival didn't pause for mysteries. Winter was approaching. The damaged section of roof still needed reinforcement. Firewood piles needed expanding. Water barrels needed cleaning. She spent the afternoon hauling lumber and repairing storm damage. Physical labor helped clear her thoughts. Almost. Near sunset, while replacing warped boards in the guest bedroom, she noticed something odd. One floorboard near the wall bore the same symbol she had seen throughout the cabin. Unlike the others, however, this carving appeared newer, more deliberate. Curious, she examined the area carefully. The board itself seemed ordinary, yet when she tapped it, the sound differed slightly from surrounding wood. Hollow. Again. Rebecca knelt and removed the board. Beneath it, she expected another small storage space. Instead, she found a narrow cloth bundle wrapped in oilskin. Her heart began pounding. Carefully, she lifted it out. Inside were several folded documents and a small notebook. The notebook belonged to her grandfather. Unlike the journals in the study, this one appeared personal, private. The first page contained only a single sentence. "If Rebecca ever finds this, she deserves the truth more than anyone." Rebecca stared at her own name written in her grandfather's handwriting. Then she turned the page. What she found there would change everything she thought she knew about her family. Rebecca sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, with her grandfather's notebook open in front of her. The fire crackled softly inside the wood stove. Outside, the mountain had fallen silent beneath a blanket of darkness. She had intended to read only a few pages before bed. Instead, hours passed without her noticing. The notebook wasn't a diary in the traditional sense. It felt more like a confession, a record of things James Turner never told anyone while he was alive. The first entries described routine events from 1974. Survey work, weather conditions, long days hiking through the mountains. Then the name Eleanor began appearing repeatedly. Rebecca turned page after page, searching for answers. What she found surprised her.
Eleanor Hayes wasn't a romantic secret. She wasn't a forgotten lover hidden from family history. She was something far more complicated. According to James's notes, Eleanor arrived in the mountains during the summer of 1974, searching for records connected to her family. She believed important information had been hidden years earlier by local officials and land surveyors. Most people dismissed her concerns. James didn't. Several entries described helping Eleanor access old county maps and property records. Together, they uncovered inconsistencies, missing files, altered boundaries, documents that seemed to disappear whenever questions were asked. Rebecca frowned. This wasn't the story she expected. She reached another entry dated September 1974.
Eleanor finally found the registry file.
If she's right, everything changes.
Rebecca sat up straighter. The following pages became increasingly tense. James described meetings with local authorities, arguments, warnings from people who wanted certain records left alone. Then, without explanation, 3 pages had been removed. The same careful cuts she had seen elsewhere. Whoever removed them knew exactly what they were looking for. Frustrated, Rebecca continued reading. Several entries later, she found another sentence that stopped her cold. Eleanor doesn't know the truth about her father. Neither does anyone else. Rebecca stared at the words. The same mystery from the unfinished letter. The same missing piece. Every clue seemed to point toward Eleanor's family history, yet the answers remained hidden behind missing pages. The next morning, a sharp knock on the cabin door interrupted her thoughts. Snow flurries drifted through the air outside. Not enough to accumulate, but enough to remind her winter was getting closer. Hank stood on the porch carrying a chainsaw and a thermos. "Tree down across the upper trail," he announced. "Thought you might want to learn something useful." Rebecca laughed. "Good morning to you, too." Within an hour, they were hiking through the forest toward the block trail. The exercise felt good after spending so much time buried in journals and documents. Fresh mountain air cleared her head. As they worked, Hank told stories about winters from decades earlier. Storms that stranded families for weeks. Temperatures that froze water lines solid. Bears breaking into cabins searching for food. Rebecca listened carefully. Every lesson felt practical. Every story carried some hidden survival tip. At one point, they stopped beside an old survey marker embedded in stone. The metal disc looked ancient. Numbers had nearly worn away completely. Rebecca immediately remembered the photograph she found beneath the floorboards. Eleanor standing beside a similar marker. "Did my grandfather work these survey lines?" she asked. Hank nodded. "Most of them." "Did he ever mention Eleanor Hayes?" The chainsaw went silent. For several seconds, Hank simply looked at the marker. "Not often, but he mentioned her a few times." Rebecca waited. Eventually, Hank sighed. "Your grandfather trusted her." "Why?" The old ranger adjusted his gloves. "Because she wasn't afraid to ask difficult questions." Before Rebecca could continue, Hank started the chainsaw again. Conversation over. Yet his reaction lingered in her thoughts throughout the afternoon. Back at the cabin, she returned to the notebook. This time she focused on dates rather than names. A pattern slowly emerged. Several entries corresponded with locations marked on the map she found in the study. One location in particular appeared repeatedly. An abandoned fire lookout tower located several miles deeper into the mountains. Next to one mention, James had written a short note. "Met Eleanor there. She finally understands." Rebecca immediately unfolded the map and located the site. The lookout tower sat on a remote ridge far from any modern roads. Why meet there? Why mention it repeatedly? More importantly, what had Eleanor finally understood? As evening approached, snow began falling more steadily outside. Rebecca spent the next hour reinforcing window seals and bringing additional firewood inside. Survival came first. Curiosity came second. Yet while stacking logs near the fireplace, she noticed something unusual about the notebook's back cover. The leather appeared thicker than necessary, almost layered. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she examined the binding. Hidden inside the rear cover was a narrow pocket she had overlooked completely. Reaching inside, she felt folded paper. Rebecca pulled it free slowly. It wasn't a photograph. It wasn't another map. It was a birth certificate. The document had yellowed with age, but the names remained readable. She looked at the child's name first, then the mother's, then the father's. The room suddenly felt very quiet. Because according to the document in her hands, Eleanor Hayes and James Turner's lives were connected in a way nobody in the family had ever imagined. Rebecca read the birth certificate 3 times before she trusted her own eyes. The document named Eleanor Hayes as the mother. The father's name had been left blank. That alone would have been surprising enough, but a handwritten note attached to the certificate transformed surprise into confusion. In her grandfather's handwriting were 7 words. The truth was hidden to protect everyone. Rebecca leaned back in her chair and stared at the fire. Snow drifted steadily outside the cabin windows, coating the mountains in white. The room felt smaller than it had an hour earlier. Every answer she uncovered seemed to create 2 new questions. Who was the child? Why had the document been hidden inside the notebook? And what kind of truth required protection for more than 50 years? Sleep proved impossible. Before dawn, she was already awake, feeding logs into the stove and studying the notebook again. Several entries now carried different meanings. References to Eleanor, mentions of county records, warnings about certain people. Her grandfather hadn't been protecting a secret romance. He had been protecting a family secret, a serious one. By mid-morning, nearly 4 inches of snow covered the property. Rebecca spent several hours shoveling paths between the cabin, woodshed, and water pump. Mountain life didn't care about mysteries. Chores still needed doing. The physical work helped settle her thoughts. While clearing snow from the porch steps, she noticed Hank's truck struggling up the driveway. The old ranger climbed out, shaking his head. "Winter's arriving early." Rebecca laughed. "You say that like winter asked permission." Hank carried 2 bags of supplies inside. Extra lamp oil, salt, batteries, the kind of practical gifts mountain neighbors considered normal. As they drank coffee, Rebecca finally showed him the birth certificate. Hank studied it quietly. His expression remained unreadable. "You knew about this?" she asked. The old ranger placed the document on the table. "Not exactly." "What does that mean?" Hank sighed. "It means people talked. About Eleanor, about your grandfather, about old arguments, old rumors." Rebecca leaned forward. "Were the rumors true?" Hank stared into his coffee cup for several moments. Most rumors start because somebody catches a glimpse of the truth without seeing the whole thing. It was a frustrating answer. Unfortunately, it also sounded honest. Before leaving, Hank said something that lingered in Rebecca's thoughts all afternoon. "If you're looking for answers, stop asking what happened to Eleanor." "Then what should I ask?" Hank pulled on his coat. "Ask what Eleanor found." The moment he left, Rebecca returned to the study. What Eleanor found. The phrase immediately reminded her of the abandoned fire lookout tower marked repeatedly throughout the journals and maps. Until now, she had assumed the tower was simply a meeting place. Suddenly, she wasn't so sure. She spread every map across the desk. The locations formed a pattern stretching through the mountains. Survey markers, old trails, remote ridges. Then she noticed something she had missed before. The lookout tower sat almost exactly at the center of every marked location. Her pulse quickened. By late afternoon, curiosity overwhelmed caution. Rebecca packed a backpack with water, food, a flashlight, and extra clothing. The lookout tower sat several miles away, but according to the map, an old trail still connected it to the cabin. The hike proved more difficult than expected. Fresh snow covered sections of the path. Fallen branches blocked others. Several times she nearly turned back. Yet the deeper she traveled into the mountains, the more determined she became. 2 hours later, the tower finally emerged from the trees. The structure looked ancient. Weathered wood, rusted metal braces, one staircase partially collapsed. The place appeared abandoned for decades. Rebecca climbed carefully. Every step creaked beneath her boots. At the top, the surrounding mountains stretched endlessly beneath a gray winter sky. For several minutes, she simply admired the view. Then she noticed something carved into the railing. The symbol. The same symbol hidden throughout the cabin, the same symbol appearing in her grandfather's journals. Her heartbeat accelerated immediately. Someone had left it here intentionally. She searched the platform carefully. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Then she spotted a loose floor plank near one corner. Kneeling down, she pried it upward. Beneath the board rested a small metal box protected by oilcloth wrapping. Rebecca stared at it in disbelief. Eleanor had hidden something here. Or James had. Or both. Either way, nobody had touched it in decades. Her fingers trembled slightly as she opened the box. Inside were several folded survey maps and a bundle of letters. One envelope sat on top of everything else. Across the front, written in Eleanor's handwriting, were 6 words that instantly sent a chill through her body. If anything happens to me. Rebecca suddenly understood why her grandfather had spent years hiding documents, why pages had been removed, why certain records disappeared. Whatever Eleanor discovered in 1974 had frightened her enough to prepare for the possibility that she might never come back. And as snow began falling harder around the old lookout tower, Rebecca realized she was finally standing at the edge of the truth. Snow swirled around the abandoned lookout tower as Rebecca carefully opened Eleanor's envelope. The paper crackled softly in her hands. 50 years of cold mountain winters had somehow failed to destroy it. For a moment, she simply stared at the words written across the front. If anything happens to me. The sentence no longer felt dramatic. It felt deliberate, like a warning from someone who understood exactly what she had uncovered. Rebecca unfolded the letter and began reading. Eleanor's handwriting was neat and steady. The first paragraphs described her research into old land surveys throughout the mountain region. Much of it echoed information Rebecca had already discovered in her grandfather's journals. Missing records, altered boundaries, property transfers that made little sense. Then the letter shifted. Eleanor revealed she had traced the discrepancies back more than 30 years. According to her findings, several influential landowners and county officials had quietly redrawn property lines during the 1940s. Hundreds of acres changed ownership on paper without many families ever realizing what happened. Rebecca frowned.
The information was surprising, but it didn't seem dangerous enough to justify decades of secrecy.
Then she reached the next section. Her breath caught. Eleanor explained that one of the affected families included her own. More importantly, she had discovered evidence that her birth records had been altered alongside the land records. Rebecca stared at the page. Altered birth records. Suddenly, the missing father on the birth certificate took on new significance. She continued reading. Eleanor believed someone intentionally concealed the identity of her biological father because his connection to the disputed land claims threatened several powerful families. The letter referenced additional documents hidden within the metal box. Rebecca immediately searched through the contents. Beneath the survey maps, she found copies of county records, handwritten notes, and several official certificates. One document in particular stood out. It was a family registry record listing births, deaths, and inheritances. Several names had been crossed out and rewritten. One entry had been corrected in different ink decades later. Eleanor had circled it repeatedly. Rebecca studied the names. Then she saw it. James Turner, her grandfather. Not as Eleanor's husband, not as her father, as her half-brother. For several seconds, Rebecca forgot about the cold, the snow, and the mountains surrounding her. She read the document again, then again. The revelation changed everything. Eleanor was not a secret lover. She was family.
She and James shared the same father but grew up in different households, separated by decisions made long before either of them understood the truth. Suddenly, dozens of mysteries fell into place. The guilt in James's journals, the unfinished letter, the hidden birth certificate, the desperate effort to preserve records. He wasn't protecting a scandal. He was protecting a sister who spent her life searching for the truth about who she was. Rebecca sat quietly inside the lookout tower for a long time. Wind whistled through cracks in the old structure. Snow accumulated against the railing. Eventually, she reached the final pages of Eleanor's letter. There, she discovered the most important revelation of all. Eleanor had finally located proof identifying their shared father. She included copies of witness statements and legal documents. Yet the truth came with a cost. Several influential families had benefited from the altered records. Public exposure would embarrass powerful people and potentially reopen old legal disputes. Eleanor believed that was why records kept disappearing, why questions were discouraged, why certain people wanted the past forgotten. As afternoon light faded, Rebecca packed everything carefully into her backpack and began the long hike back toward the cabin. The journey proved more difficult than expected. Snow now covered portions of the trail. Twice, she lost sight of the path completely. Several times she considered stopping until morning, but instinct pushed her forward. The documents felt too important to leave anywhere else. By the time she reached the cabin, darkness had settled across the mountains. Light glowed warmly through the windows. Relief washed over her. Then she noticed something unusual. A second vehicle sat in the driveway. Hank's truck. Rebecca hurried toward the porch. The old ranger opened the door before she reached it. "I was about to come looking for you," he said. His expression immediately told her something was wrong. "What happened?" Hank stepped aside. "You got a visitor." Inside the cabin sat an elderly woman Rebecca had never seen before. Silver hair, weathered face, sharp eyes. She stood slowly as Rebecca entered. For several moments, neither spoke. Then the woman looked directly at the documents protruding from Rebecca's backpack. "You found Eleanor's records," she said quietly. Rebecca froze. "How do you know that?" The woman smiled sadly. Because Eleanor was my mother. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Rebecca stared in disbelief. 50 years of mystery suddenly stood in front of her wearing a winter coat and snow-covered boots. The woman took a careful breath before speaking again. And if the documents are what I think they are, then you and I are family. Rebecca barely slept that night. The woman sitting across from her fireplace had a name, Sarah Collins, and according to the documents hidden for half a century, she was Eleanor Hayes's daughter. Snow continued falling outside while the two women talked deep into the night. Sarah explained that she had spent most of her life with only fragments of her mother's story. Eleanor rarely spoke about her past. She kept a small box of photographs, a handful of letters, and one persistent belief. Somewhere in the mountains existed proof that would explain everything. She never stopped looking, Sarah said quietly, while turning a faded photograph between her fingers. Even when people told her to let it go. Rebecca understood that now. The records from the lookout tower had revealed the truth. Eleanor and James Turner were not strangers. They were half-siblings separated by decisions made decades before either of them could understand. Their father, a wealthy landowner involved in the disputed property claims, had hidden the relationship to protect his reputation and business interests. Birth records were altered, legal documents were rewritten. Entire branches of the family were erased from official history. Eleanor spent years uncovering what happened. James spent years helping her. Neither had managed to fully restore the truth before time ran out. The next morning brought clear skies for the first time in days. Sunlight reflected brilliantly off fresh snow covering the mountains. Rebecca stood on the porch holding a cup of coffee while watching smoke rise from the cabin chimney. The scene felt different somehow. When she first arrived, the cabin represented escape, a place to hide from the collapse of her marriage. Now it felt like something else entirely, a place where lost pieces of a family had finally found each other. Over the following weeks, life settled into a new rhythm. Winter arrived fully. Rebecca learned how to keep water lines from freezing. She learned how to predict storms by watching cloud formations above the ridges. She learned which sounds in the night mattered and which could be ignored. More importantly, she stopped feeling like a visitor. The cabin gradually became home. Sarah visited often. Together they sorted through journals, maps, photographs, and records collected by both Eleanor and James. Every box revealed another small piece of the story. Sometimes the discoveries were dramatic. More often, they were simple. A photograph identifying a relative, a letter explaining a misunderstanding, a forgotten family recipe tucked between legal documents. Small things. Human things, yet each one helped restore a history that had been fractured for generations. One snowy afternoon, Hank arrived carrying a folder of his own. "Found this while cleaning out an old storage trunk," he said. Inside were survey photographs taken in 1974. Several showed James and Eleanor working together on mountain trails. In every picture, they appeared happy. Not because they had solved the mystery yet, because they were solving it together. Rebecca studied those photographs for a long time. For years, she had viewed her grandfather through the limited lens of family stories. Now she saw a fuller version of the man. Not perfect, not heroic, just deeply loyal. A man willing to spend decades protecting a sister the world told him to forget. By early spring, the final pieces fell into place. Copies of the corrected family records were submitted to local archives. Historical societies preserved Eleanor's research. The altered land records were formally documented so future generations would understand what happened. No lawsuits followed.
No dramatic courtroom battles emerged. Too much time had passed. Most of the people responsible were long gone. Yet something more important happened. The truth survived. One evening, nearly a year after arriving at the cabin, Rebecca sat on the porch watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. The same porch she had once viewed as part of a broken-down property nobody wanted. Fresh paint now covered the railings. The roof had been fully repaired. Firewood stood stacked neatly beside the woodshed. Birds nested near the creek. The place felt alive again. Sarah sat beside her. Hank occupied his usual chair. Martha had delivered enough baked goods to feed everyone twice over. For a while, they simply watched the mountains darken beneath the evening sky. Eventually, Sarah smiled. "You know, if not for that divorce, none of this would have happened." Rebecca laughed softly. For months, she would have hated hearing those words. Now, she understood them. Losing her marriage had felt like the end of everything. In reality, it had led her here, to the cabin, to the mountains, to family she never knew existed, to a purpose she never expected to find. Later that night, after everyone left, Rebecca walked through the quiet cabin one final time before bed. The hidden study remained exactly where it had always been. The floorboards had been repaired, the journals organized, the photographs preserved. She paused beside the fireplace and looked around the room. The mystery was solved. The truth was no longer hidden. Yet the cabin still felt full of stories. Maybe it always would. Outside, wind moved gently through the pine trees. Inside, warmth filled the rooms her grandfather had built with his own hands. Rebecca smiled and turned off the lamp. For the first time in many years, she wasn't worried about what came next. Some inheritances come in the form of money. Others come in the form of property. But the most valuable inheritance she received from that old mountain cabin was something far greater. It was the chance to rebuild a life she thought was broken, reconnect a family that history tried to erase, and discover that sometimes losing one future is the only way to find the one you were meant to have all along.